This part is always one of my highlights. I am also a Philanthropy Lab alumni, so it's near and dear to my heart. So every year we try to bring a student who took the Philanthropy Lab course who is now working in philanthropy, which is a very niche space. And we're going to hear from a couple other speakers today that also are working in philanthropy. But today I have the pleasure of introducing to you Kaci Thane, who was a Texas A&M student in 2017 in the Philanthropy Lab course there with Professor Kyle Gammenthaler. And she was also an ambassador. She was sitting in these seats in 2017. So years ago, so you can talk to her about that as well. And she now is working at the Communities Foundation of Texas as a philanthropy officer of learning and insights. So you're going to get to hear from her, and she's also being interviewed by Professor Jim Orr, who you guys have met, who's wonderful as well. So I'm going to invite them up and let you guys enjoy.
Well, just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know Bethany just mentioned that you're a Texas A&M graduate, but tell us a little bit more than that. Where are you from originally?
Yeah, so I'm from not too far from here, a small town outside of Waco, and then followed family to A&M, so a proud Aggie, but have friends from other universities, so I'm not like so into A&M that I can't accept that other universities are good too. But I was a business major at A&M, specifically in the nonprofit management track, so a little bit unique, just being in the business school, but focusing on nonprofits, and then, as Bethany mentioned, kind of followed that trajectory straight into a career in philanthropy, and excited to be here to talk to you all today.
Very good. Well, tell us a little bit about the Communities Foundation of Texas. Tell us about that organization, and also talk a little bit about sort of how you got connected to the organization.
Absolutely. So just for additional context to kind of situate Communities Foundation of Texas just within the broader field of foundations, there's kind of like four big buckets. There's your corporate foundations, there's your big public foundations, your private, which are more like your family foundations, and then there's community foundations. And community foundations are a little bit different from the other three because they are really driven by the interests of the community. So Communities Foundation of Texas is really driven by the individuals that live in North Texas. We're situated in Dallas, but we kind of support the 5 counties surrounding Dallas. And what we have, which is similar to a lot of other community foundations, are things called donor-advised funds. And the easiest way to think about these are like charitable banking accounts. So we have individual donors putting money into these funds, and then those are being invested, and the interest on that is being invested back into the community at the discretion of those individual donors. So a lot of what Communities Foundation of Texas in general does is kind of really encourage donors to identify what they're interested in and then connects them to organizations based on those interests to really help them match up their giving with what they want to support. My team specifically is kind of on the flip side of that, where we're giving away dollars. And so those come from funds of donors who have since passed on and have given the responsibility of granting those funds out to our team. So we have anywhere between $12 to $15 million a year, and a lot of those interest areas, like I said, are really determined by what the donors were interested in during their life. So it runs the gamut from animals and arts to education and economic security, really all over the place based on those individual donor interests.
Very good. So one question some folks might want to know is, why would the individual, as opposed to just giving directly to a charitable organization that they're interested in, kind of use the community foundation as a intervening party?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. We kind of have two big answers to that. One is the ability to kind of multiply your individual impact. So a lot of times we have opportunities that connect donors to other donors. So one donor may only be able to give a couple $1,000s, and same thing with another individual donor, but we can bring them projects where they can put their dollars together to make much larger gifts than, like I said, they would be able to do independently. So there's kind of one value in that of just like connecting other individuals who are all passionate about the same cause to make a deeper impact than they would alone. And the other is, I mean, in North Texas alone, there's over 3,000 nonprofits. Like there's a lot of organizations, and it can be really overwhelming for an individual individual who really wants to invest in someone who's like moving the needle and doing really impactful work to actually find an organization that kind of fits that criteria. So we do a lot of matchmaking too, to kind of connect organizations and donors when there's a really strong alignment between what the organization is doing and what the funder is really interested in supporting. So really kind of like bringing their individual philanthropy to kind of like that next degree by providing some kind of like coaching and resources along the way.
Very good. So did you have any connection to the community foundation prior to this particular conference?
I didn't, and actually it was this conference that kind of pretty significantly impacted my trajectory. So I was an alumni in between my junior and senior year. So at that point I had pretty much already identified I was really interested in the nonprofit space and I wanted to pursue a career in it, but I didn't really know exactly what that looked like yet. And I was an ambassador at this conference and was connected with the then Chief Philanthropy Officer at CFT, who her just philosophy towards grant making was really interesting to me. And so after the conference, I reached out to her and connected to her, and there happened to be an opening at the foundation. And so that's really what kind of led me to my current position at CFT, was making that connection. And really, like I said, based on her orientation towards philanthropy and using data to really do philanthropy really effectively was really interesting, and I thought was like an innovative idea. And so I just wanted to be a part of a team that was kind of doing some new things in the space and not just like traditional grant making as I had been exposed to previously.
So she was a panelist at the conference.
She was. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and you all had panelists that are here.
She used to fill, yeah.
That's right. So tell us a little bit then about your specific role with the Community Foundation now. You mentioned your interest in data-driven evaluation and whatnot. What are you doing now with the Community Foundation?
Yes, so I've been at CFT for a little over 6 years, so my role has kind of changed a little bit just the longer I'm there. When I originally started, I was supporting our kind of smaller dollar grant making in the area of like $15,000 to $30,000, really for general operating support, but quickly got pulled into our kind of more innovative grant making program that was really focused on measuring outcomes for grants, and if we're trying to move the needle on something like, for instance, the economic security of individuals. So we were looking at their wages over time, like were they better off because of certain programs, like really kind of hard data to understand like to what extent organizations were really closing the gap on certain things. I got really interested in that area, and the kind of informal functions of learning and insights morphed into an actual formal team, and I moved over to that a couple of years ago. So my day-to-day role, or my title, is an officer in learning and insights, and a lot of what that entails is tracking kind of trends within the community and making sure we're staying on top of like what the community is asking for, what community needs are, as well as kind of consolidating and analyzing what we're learning from our individual grants and reporting that back both internally with our program officers and externally with the larger community, to make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel on anything, and that organizations have access to organizations and other information that would be helpful in being more impactful with their programs. I think there's oftentimes a lot of organizations working in the same mission space that unfortunately don't get to connect and share learnings, even though they're facing the same problems. They're all kind of just like attacking them with the same solutions and not necessarily getting to kind of cut down on like some of that learning curve. So a lot of what I do is really focused on, like I said, kind of like breaking down those silos and sharing information both within our organization and in the broader community at large.
Would you say that that work that you're doing with the Community Foundation kind of, I don't know, does that affect or impact what your own sort of personal goals within the philanthropy space are at this time?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think the interesting thing about having a career in philanthropy is it's a little bit hard to like separate like your personal interests and your like professional ones, and especially in my seat where I have access to a lot of data. I don't think Dallas is necessarily unique in the fact that we have a lot of issues because of kind of the way that things were done historically. There's a lot of communities that were disinvested in for different reasons, and a lot of kind of inequities that still exist to this day. And I see that in my professional life, and it's hard for me to like ignore that in my personal giving now that like kind of that veil has been taken off. So there's a lot of ways in which I think the information and the organizations that I'm exposed to professionally kind of impact my interests personally. Personally, I'm interested in like green space and arts, and that's not necessarily what we dedicate a lot of our funding to, but like the approach in terms of like finding information about what organizations are actually doing, like their outcomes and how they're achieving that, and then how they're promoting equity, like that's kind of the similar thread that I carry, whether it's like working with organizations through my role at CFT, or finding organizations that I like personally want to get back to with my own like time and money.
Very good. And so in terms of going forward, you and I were talking just before this. I understand you've got some plans coming up as far as what is kind of your next step, right?
Yeah.
And tell us about that.
Yeah, so I kind of, like I said, I stumbled into this career a little bit just because it was really kind of an output of me like chasing what I was interested in. And I think when I first started at CFT, I really had a limited view of what the opportunities within philanthropy were. I thought it was really limited to like fundraising or like reviewing grants. I didn't know the full spectrum of opportunities. But since I've been in this role, I've been exposed to just a wide variety of career opportunities. And specifically, as I mentioned, I'm interested in kind of this data side and this like connecting organizations to information that can really help them. And so I'm actually going back to school this fall to get kind of that background in like research methodologies to really understand like how to better support organizations in both like designing their programs so that they can learn from them and get better over time, and also to kind of translate data that is oftentimes in like academic speak or just isn't as accessible to like everyday lay people working on the grounds in community, to make sure that they have equitable access to information. So like I said, I definitely couldn't have predicted 6 years ago that I'd want to go back and get a master's in applied social science, but that's kind of where my trajectory has led me, just because I've been following kind of like my interests and all of the different career opportunities that I've been exposed to now that I'm in the space.
And where are you going to do that?
In the University of Chicago. So switching the Texas weather for a brutal winter, but not thinking about that yet.
I think they're the same colors as A&M, though. Aren't
They are, yeah. So good thing I like maroon.
Okay. Tell us a story, perhaps something that's happened within your nonprofit work that has been meaningful or has kind of changed your perspective about that work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the biggest perspective shift that I had was when I was still in school. I think my interactions with like philanthropy and the social sector were pretty limited. I mean, I did like food drives at school and like one-off donations, but I never really thought about like the strategy or like the role that nonprofits play like in the larger like community. And I thought that nonprofits really, to put it simplistically, were kind of just like filling a need. Like they were a little bit more kind of like reactive to gaps in the community. Like I thought of like the food pantry and like homeless shelters and things like that. And it wasn't until I was like trying to figure out like what I want my major to be and kind of where I wanted to like go, that someone mentioned that nonprofits are really like the ideal space for innovation and for incubating new ideas. And that was just kind of like a mind-blowing moment, because I didn't really think of them as that. I didn't think of them as a space for like entrepreneurship and like creative ideas. But like once they said that, it made a lot of sense. It seemed obvious. Like you have these organizations that are really close to community, that know exactly like what communities need, and they have the opportunity to kind of design new solutions, which is definitely what you need when you have a lot of issues that have been in society for a long time. Like you need new ways of thinking about it. And so that perspective shift of just the value and the role that the philanthropic sector and the social sector at large has in supporting innovation, I think was just a huge shift and made me really interested in like, well, how do you actually encourage that and how do you get involved? Because there's a lot of really cool ideas happening in the space now that my eye is like trained to see them.
Yeah. So would you say that you have found the work to be really rewarding and kind of allowed you to live into some of those goals and ideals and enabled you to kind of have a much broader perspective relative to the philanthropic work that you have?
I think so. I mean, philanthropy is just one component of the social sector. And so, we really are a bridge to a lot of different things, and we're made better by having relationships with organizations and like other players within the philanthropic space. So I think having like an eye towards innovation means that you have your eye on like what is government and like policy interested in learning to be able to like scale something, or what does an individual organization actually need to actually like test new ideas. I feel like when you look at it through an innovation lens, it does expand it beyond philanthropy, just kind of to support the larger ecosystem. Yeah.
Very good. So what is your sort of your least favorite part of your job currently?
Grant making takes a lot of admin. I think that's like the one thing that just like gets in the way sometimes, or it feels like it does. I mean, when we release an application, it's usually like 5-6 months before money actually gets out the door. And there's a lot of reasons for like that process, just to make sure every application gets a fair review, and like we're making decisions very strategically and aligned with the goals we're trying to achieve. But at the end of the day, it does mean that we can't be as fast in like getting dollars to organizations to do the work. There's usually like some lead time there, so I wish it was faster. I wish it didn't take so much like admin and emails and contracting, but that's just the nature of the game when you're trying to get things lined up and make sure that like money is being directed towards things that you really want to invest in.
All right, the flip side of that, so what's your favorite part of your job?
I'm gonna cheat and choose 2 things. One of those is, I think the con of being so close to data is sometimes you can see numbers that are really disheartening. And I don't think, like I said, Dallas is necessarily unique, but when you look at the challenges that we still have to overcome, like it can be really daunting. But my favorite part is getting to balance that with being in community, because there's some like really brilliant and compassionate people who have some just incredible ideas and are really working in communities, and getting to have that like firsthand experience, or like that front row seat to seeing what they're doing that I don't think I would have if I weren't in this seat, is really energizing and gives me a lot of hope to kind of, like I said, balance with the numbers. And then the second thing is I love when we get to bring different organizations around the table and like talk through like what they're learning, and to get to like see like a couple months later that they've implemented something and it's made a positive change. And oftentimes nonprofits just don't have the time or space to like get connected with each other. And so to get to be a part of those conversations, we learn ourselves, but to see that there's like a tangible impact from that, that's really rewarding.
Very good. So I know one thing that's important to folks these days is work-life balance. Do you feel like that your job allows you to have that kind of work-life balance? And if so, what are some of the things that you like to balance with?
Yeah. If anyone has any tips for that, I'm always open to that. I do think it's hard in philanthropy, especially because it's oftentimes issues that you really care about. It's hard to just like clock out at 5 o'clock and say like, okay, I don't care about that issue anymore. And oftentimes, I mean, even though we're a foundation and we're very privileged in the resources that we have, we're still like nonprofits in that people wear multiple hats, and like we're a limited team trying to do a lot of work. So sometimes the balance isn't there, and that's more just like on my own personal boundaries, because I really care about the work, than it is on kind of like being mandated to work overtime. But I do think that like there is opportunities and spaces just even within a career in philanthropy to kind of like separate what your professional role is and what your personal role is. It's a muscle that like I'm still getting better at, but I think like I said, it's like a skill that you need regardless of what industry you're in. So I don't think philanthropy is necessarily like unique in the challenges of balancing those 2 things.
And so what are some of the things that you like to do outside of work?
Yes. I'm a huge yoga person, but I also have a dog. So when the weather is not 100 degrees, spending a lot of time outside, and then, everything that everyone also enjoys doing, friends, sports games, things like that. I mean, Mavericks and the Stars kind of put us through the ringer recently. So I don't know if that necessarily was a stress release, but yeah, there's definitely a lot of opportunity. I think the nice thing about being in a philanthropic role is that I've been exposed to so many organizations that I would have never heard of otherwise. So the volunteer opportunities are kind of unlimited and are great outlets, especially after long weeks. Mm-hmm.
All right, so how would you say that your experience with the philanthropy lab and your philanthropy class at Texas A&M, how did that sort of inform your future? Mm-hmm. Looking back on it a few years now.
Yeah, I had already, so I took the philanthropy lab class the spring of my junior year, like I mentioned. So I had already kind of spent some time kind of exploring what I was interested in and what I wanted to do after school. And I had spent some time in a student organization that did kind of consulting projects with nonprofits. So I knew I was interested in the like social sector, but I was having a really hard time figuring out like what issue area I truly wanted to like focus on. And when I took the strategic philanthropy course, it was kind of like an aha moment of there's this other space within the social sector, the like foundation space and like the philanthropy support space, where I don't necessarily have to pigeonhole myself into like one issue. I can sit at a higher level and kind of support the field as a whole. And so that was like the first time that I had kind of like truly been introduced to like philanthropy and like the foundation space as a true like career opportunity that I could explore. But also I think because I was a college student and had never made any like sizable gifts, I had never thought about like the strategic investment of dollars. And I had a lot of really smart classmates who were like asking really good questions that I had never thought to ask organizations before. And so just even being exposed to those conversations and like how to think about investing in our local community just based on the organizations and the work that they were doing and then the community needs, like that was just all really enlightening because it's a process that I hadn't been through before and I really enjoyed it. So I think that kind of like started the itch to like be interested in philanthropy, and then like I said, kind of just followed that just as I got kind of more involved in that space.
Very good. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then after that, I'll open it up to you all to ask any questions you want to ask. But I guess my last question is, what advice do you have for the students in the room here that might be interested in finding work in the field of philanthropy?
Yeah. First piece of advice is a career in philanthropy doesn't have to be linear. So if it's something that you're interested in, you don't have to start like I did where like your first job out of college is in philanthropy. In fact, a majority of my team, there's 13 people, only 3 of us started that way. The rest landed in philanthropy after other careers. Like we have a doctor on our team who spent 15 years as a physician before coming back to lead our health work. We have a teacher on our team who did the same before coming to lead our education work. Like I think it's more important to kind of like focus on like what you're interested in terms of like what actual roles you want to have, and like if there's an issue area that you're passionate about, you can always kind of make the jump into philanthropy. Just because you don't start there doesn't mean you've like kind of closed that door. And the other piece of advice is don't limit your thinking in the way that I did in terms of like there's only 2 roles in philanthropy, like fundraising and grant making. And maybe you guys are ahead of me and are not thinking that, but I had a very limited view and thought those were the only 2 options. And it wasn't until I was in the space that I realized there are so many more opportunities. One, because foundations need HR teams, they need accountants, they need finance teams. So just because that wasn't like your major to be in philanthropy doesn't mean there's not a foundation that has a role for you. But also, there's so many niche positions like mine that, you know, if you're interested in something, there's probably a role for you. You just have to work a little bit harder to find it. So just don't limit your thinking on what opportunities may be available. Just depending on what you're interested in, there may be a good fit for you out there.
All right, very good. So I'll open it up now to the questions from the audience. Raise your hand if you've got a question.
Hello, thank you for the conversation. My name is Halan. You're entering this transitional period in which you've worked and then now you're attending grad school. So drawing from your prior experience in the field of philanthropy and just, I guess, your overall like experiences in general, what do you hope to gain out of grad school that you feel would be most impactful and applicable in the world of philanthropy, especially with your focus in terms of like data and nonprofit work?
Great question. So learning and evaluation is kind of like a really emerging field within the philanthropic space. And so there's a lot of people who've like spent their career in like data and evaluation research now making the jump, but there's like kind of a barrier to like translating the value of like data to nonprofit organizations. I'm kind of taking the opposite approach where I have all like the context and experience of how organizations use the data. I'm going back to get a better understanding of like how data is collected and how data, like to read it, to be able to translate it back to organizations. So really hoping to kind of post my graduate's degree dive deeper into this like learning space within the social sector, because there's just so many needs within individual organizations in the larger field to make data accessible. A lot of times organizations don't have the data resource or just the expertise to decode data in a way that would make sense for the organization. So that's kind of what I'm taking with me, is like how would an organization use data, and then how can I kind of help bridge that gap between it. Mm-hmm.
All right, good question.
Hi, Kaci. First of all, congrats on getting into Chicago.
Thank you.
That's awesome. So yesterday, after listening to like the 5 top organizations, I was really like confronted by the fact that there's so much like systemic injustice within the various facets of American society and beyond. And I was just curious as to how, like, after being in the nonprofit world for 6 years, do you maintain your like morale and stamina to like continue in the field?
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great question. And like I said, when you're really close to that data all the time, it can get really discouraging. I think my orientation has always been to look for the bright spots, because they're definitely there. And I think that there are, data can kind of look however you're wanting to look at it. And so I think sometimes there are really discouraging trends, like discouraging things where you're like, oh, we are not even making progress, we're going backwards. And there are other areas where there are really exciting things happening. And so I think that's always been kind of the focus, is using data to learn to be better, even though like at the initial state we can agree things are not looking great, but what are we doing with this information now that we know it? And that's kind of where we flip into not despairing, but like an action moment. Like, how are we going to try to do our best to address it? Knowing that there's some things that take time, like take 10, 15 years before you even start to move the needle. So patience, and then, like I said, looking for like what are those bright spots and what are those opportunities to like lean into where the data does look good. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you for everything you've said so far. I guess my question is especially regarding community foundations and donor advised funds and how that works a bit more. Do you find yourself working more with the organizations of giving the grants to the organizations and balancing it with like the donors? Like, which one do you find yourself working more with, and how do you balance the two sides of that work?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So I'm going to back up a little bit so you kind of understand the dynamics of CFT a little bit more. So we have 2 teams that kind of really focus on that. We have our relationships team that is kind of working with donors to understand who they're interested in. And then we have my team, the philanthropy team, that is really connected to the organizations in the community and are giving the money out. And our money comes from funds, like I said, where the donors have passed away. And so we're really relying on kind of their historical intent for those funds. So in our instance, we're oftentimes not working with a donor. We're working with what did they say their interests were that we're wanting to do over time. But there is an important piece that our department plays just in that overall donor engagement role, which is education, which is trying to say, if you're interested in education, like, let's unpack that. What does that mean? Does that mean you're interested in early childhood education? Okay, well, let's help you understand, what does that even look like in the North Texas community? Like, what are the big things that you should know if you're interested in that area? Like, literacy scores, and what organizations are really working to address that gap, because that's a huge need. So that's when we come in, like, once they've kind of done that initial kind of like, this is what I'm interested in, we don't necessarily kind of like influence that. It's once you've identified that, then how can we help you be a more informed grant maker based on our expertise and kind of our experience with who's in that space.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then.
Hi, thank you so much for your answers to the questions. It's been very cool hearing about like the data workings and things like that. what do you think about the accessibility and transparency of data, and if we're shifting toward the direction of standardization? Because like when I was looking at the JPAL lab and the randomized control trials, it was very opaque and like hard to decode like what those figures mean. And a lot of the trials said like, this isn't available, but these are the results, or some of the results were like had holes in them. Like how do you shift toward a more open source approach for that? And is that happening?
That's a very big question. I'm going to try my best to answer that. So yes, it's happening to some extent. So I think for us as a foundation, the thing that we're most, focused on, or we feel like is most important within kind of an individual organization's access to data, is their own internal capacity. And sometimes that means it's not a randomized control trial or like an official study that's the best data for them to go off of. It is, what are their own internal systems for tracking who their participants are, who their clients are, just depending on what mission space they're in, and what are the outcomes of their individual program. Because oftentimes that information is much more accessible and much more impactful in terms of understanding like how to best support their initiatives. When it comes to like the larger question of like, can organizations like access randomized control trials or anything that falls into that, like what's the best practice for them if they're starting a new program or want to kind of leverage the learning of others, that's a really big need that I don't think anyone has like truly solved, because oftentimes it is like hyper specific to the area where the randomized control trial was studied, and so like there's limitations in terms of what's translated, or it requires someone who has an understanding of that own organization's programs to be even at the table to understand. So a long way of saying it's not necessarily like an overall broad stroke, this is how we solve this problem. It's often like based on individual organizations, like what are their true needs, what are they trying to solve, or what are they hoping to use data to answer. And CFT specifically, a lot of our relationships with organizations, like we're trying to meet that need at an individual organization level instead of like I said, painting a big picture.
All right, thank you so much, Kaci, and let's show Kaci our appreciation.
Thank you guys so much.